research around the third grade reading guarantee. It's research that we believe has been long needed to be able to talk definitively about how our students do who are retained and those who are in a similar group are promoted. So you'll hear from the researchers about that today, but this is one-of-a-kind research in Ohio based on Ohio students. We'll have some folks with us later in the press conference that can talk a little bit about similar research that has been done in other states. Just a bit about Ohio Excels. We are a nonprofit that was created by leaders in the business community to more consistently and deeply engage the business community's voice in improving educational outcomes for students. And not surprising probably to all of you as a business organization, we believe in using data and research to inform policy decisions. So we are excited to share this research with all of you today, but also to share it with our policymakers who are making some really important decisions over the next couple of weeks around education in the state, but also very specifically around literacy and the third grade reading retention. I think what you're going to see from this research would give us reason to caution our lawmakers against making unnecessary changes to a policy that clearly is doing its job. So in a few minutes, you're going to hear from the researchers, and I would encourage you to ask them all the difficult questions about the research. We have from the Ohio Education Research Center, Josh Holley and Ani Ruhil, and they conducted this research for us, and they will speak to the specifics of it. One thing that I would mention, though, as I said, that this is one-of-a-kind research in Ohio, and Josh and Ani will get a little bit more into this, but we've been getting a lot of questions about why we support the retention component. We've also gotten a lot of questions about why is this research and data different than perhaps what others are sharing about third grade retention. And I think it's really important to note that this analysis is unlike other research that has been done around Ohio's third grade reading retention. This research does not simply summarize scores. This research focuses very specifically on literacy-based retention. The other studies have not done that. Other studies have not had comparison groups. You'll hear Ani and Josh talk about the comparison groups and what we're able to see over time in terms of student performance. And this study also uses a gold standard research methodology, and they will get into the specifics of that in just a moment. This study looked at two cohorts of students. Those students that started third grade in the 2013-2014 school year, and then those students that started third grade in the 2014-2015 school year, and the data goes through 2019. And they will talk about why we stopped at 2019. As you all probably know, COVID came along, we didn't give assessments, and so they will talk about what that means. I think the other thing that I would say is, it was really important to us that we have this research, that we not just have anecdotal conversations. And I would be dishonest if I didn't say that the results surprised even us. We undertook this really not knowing what the research was going to tell us, but felt as we were having these conversations that we really needed to know definitively whether or not retention was working or not working. And so what we found is that students that are in similar ranges, so those that are just above the cut score and are promoted, and those that are just below the cut score and retained, those are the groups of students we're talking about. And those students that were retained do better in English language arts and math in a fairly substantial way, from third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, and seventh grade. And as I said, Ani and Josh will talk about that. The other thing that I want to mention is that our concern about this issue isn't just retention. Our concern, and the reason that we are focused on this, and the reason that the business community cares so much about this, is reading in general. We have to have more kids reading at grade level, being proficient readers, not just in third grade. If you look at the data, we see struggling readers in kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. We see that in third grade. But we also see that their kids are being promoted who continue to struggle to read. When you look at the state data, 40% of kids at every grade level are not proficient in English language arts. And so what are we going to do about that? And our argument is not just let's focus on retention. It is this state needs to be urgent in its response to helping kids learn to read. We all know it is a critical skill. Kids who cannot read well struggle in school. There's research that will be shared later from Pat Teaberry that will amplify that for all of you. But we believe that our state needs to have adequate resources, supports, and interventions to ensure all of our kids are reading. And I might remind all of you, I know many of you cover education, so you know this, but when you look at the promotion score does not equal proficiency. We use a lower cut score on the test. It's at the high level or the low level of basic. Actually, I'll let Ani and Josh tell you exactly what's at. My researcher is like, oh, stop. So what we want to make sure of is that kids become strong readers. So we're happy to talk about this research. We're really excited to have this research. As you all know, there are a lot of policy conversations that are happening right now around third grade retention, but there's also really important policy conversations that are happening around literacy in general. The governor has proposed significant resources around professional development for teachers in the science of reading, high-quality instructional materials, literacy coaches, and so we are really excited about the urgency and the investments that are being discussed right now in the budget. And the purpose of this research is to help reinforce those conversations. So I'm going to stop talking right now. I'm going to introduce to you my boss, Pat Teaberry, who's the president and CEO of the Ohio Business Roundtable, and he also serves as the chair of Ohio Excel. So Pat, thank you for being with us today.
Hardly your boss. Thank you. My name is Pat Teaberry. I'm the president and CEO of the Ohio Business Roundtable. The Ohio Business Roundtable is a trade association that was founded in 1992 by a group of CEOs from around the state, large employers who care about Ohio's future, who care about Ohio as it relates to other peer states, making us competitive economic development-wise, so we could continue to grow jobs, grow the economy, make sure there were places where people could work. Been there for 5 years. That is still an important goal of this organization. But everything related to it, including workforce. So if you think about workforce, there are a number of things that we as an organization and our members lean into, because it's really an all-of-the-above strategy to attract workers. Second chance programs. It's four-year college degrees. It's two-year college degrees. It's credentials. It's certificates. It's attracting people from other states. It's, again, all the above. But it all starts with having people who can read. That's simple. So it's important for us as an organization, it's important for the business community, but for me it's also personal. Why is that? I'm the first in my family to graduate from high school. My parents came here from Italy, didn't speak the language, and said to me, as the oldest of their 3 kids, and to my younger siblings, and education is important. You have to read. You have to learn how to write. You have to get a high school degree, a diploma, to be successful. And in America, you can do anything if you know how to read and write and get a degree. You pass your own future, right? So many kids today aren't. The research is, the anecdotes are one thing, the research is tragic, quite frankly. The scores are heartbreaking. It's a crisis today, not just in our states, but many other states. And there's no more significant benchmark in education than ensuring that students are proficient readers before they leave elementary school. This isn't a difficult thing. It's pretty simple. Understanding the politics are tough. But what's tougher is looking at the research. And that's what this event is today. So I'm excited we have two terrific researchers here that can tell you a little bit more about it, some charts that are eye-popping. In fact, the numbers are so startling to me, it's like you can't even, it's too startling. It's like hard to believe these numbers. Let me give you some eye-opening stats that he's talked about. According to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, students who do not read proficiently, this is not me saying this is not employers saying this is an independent foundation. Students who do not read proficiently by 3rd grade are 4 times more likely to leave high school without a diploma compared to proficient readers. And usually that doesn't lead to good consequences for your future. If the student is economically disadvantaged, the risk is multiplied, and they are 6 times more likely to not graduate. Research by the Ohio Department of Education found that students who are proficient in reading, by 3rd grade, were 5 times more likely to be college and career ready. And today, there's a shortage of that in Ohio. In 2012, the Ohio General Assembly passed the third grade reading guarantee, which is what we're talking about today. A critical piece of legislation aimed at ensuring that no Ohio student left elementary school. No Ohio student left elementary school unable to read. It's kind of like common sense, right? It shouldn't even be controversial. If you socially promote a kid into middle school who can't read, having had 4 daughters go through middle school, it's tough enough when you can read. It's tough enough when you have 2 parents that are focused on you every day. It's tough enough when you are economically advantaged. Just think about that. We owe it to these kids. As lawmakers discuss removing that retention component without ensuring that adequate resources, supports, interventions, transparency, accountability are in place to support these struggling kids, these readers who can't read. This is only going to lead to worse academic outcomes, unfair to our children, their families, and the state. They simply don't deserve it. We, as a state, can't afford it. Long term, we can't afford it. They can't afford it. We need to be willing to face this challenge directly, courageously, and I'm going to say again, more transparently, with the numbers that are the numbers, the national assessment numbers, the researchers' numbers, the department's numbers. The data and the rhetoric do not match today. They simply don't. And our students are paying the ultimate price. Already, Ohio's youngest school children appear to be some of the worst affected by the learning declines made worse by the pandemic, according to our state assessments and national assessments. This is just, again, depressing. 3rd graders in Ohio experienced a 22% point reduction in reading proficiency during the pandemic. From 67% being able to read in 2018-2019 school year to 51.9 in in 2020, 2021. A little over half of our students were proficient in the 2020-21 school year. Again, tragic. As a state, we must be urgent in addressing this challenge and ensure that our strategy is much more robust and comprehensive and based on research and data specific to Ohio's students' performance. This isn't our test. This isn't my test. This isn't our assessment. This isn't Ohio Excel's assessment. The numbers are the numbers. We cannot continue to promote students. 40% at each grade level who are not proficient in reading. I mean, think about that. How are we helping them? 40%. Doing so is likely to lead to a life of educational and, quite frankly, economic and financial hardship. We know that. And on top of all that, today is the knowledge economy, right? I can't believe I'm going to say this. I read my newspaper on a tablet, not on a newspaper, which I would have never imagined in a million years. The knowledge economy. It's time. We are lucky to have today two researchers, and I'd like to introduce them. Joshua Hawley and Ani Rugel from the Ohio Education Research Center to share their research. Thank you, gentlemen, so much.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Josh Hawley from Ohio State University, and I run the Ohio Education Research Center. Along with my colleague, Ani Rugel from Ohio University, we were pleased to collaborate with Ohio Excels on this study. And just to set a little bit of context here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ani, who is the principal statistician on this project. The study uses data from the Ohio Department of Education in two different ways. It uses student data from 2012 to 2019 for a descriptive study, and then it focuses in on a cohort of students from 2013 through 2015 who were subject to the retention policy and for which we have similar scores. So that's an important distinction in a statistical sense. Kind of overall, about 600,000 students. There's about 20,000 students who were kind of subject to the retention policy. And I think it kind of reinforces the fact that very small numbers of kids are actually retained every year, 2%, 3% in prior years. So the descriptive stuff reinforces that this, while a very important consideration, is affecting a very small percentage of kids in the prior years when it was pre-COVID. I will say just two things about the regression discontinuity part of it. This is a statistical design that Ani will describe the results of that is equivalent to doing, it's as best as we can do to doing an experimental design when you can't randomly assign people. So you know, when you're a doctor and you want to figure out a drug works, you randomly assign people to treatment or control or treatment or placebo. This is not, this is a really important kind of statement to be able to make, that we used a very sophisticated methodology called regression discontinuity, which takes advantage of the fact that we have kind of a continuous score and we have a hard cutoff of people in a given year who are subject to the policy. So I'm going to turn it over to Ani, and he's going to talk a little bit about the results, and then we'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Morning, everybody. My name is Ani. Work with Josh and Evan and the Ohio Education Research Center on various studies. Was happy to be a part of this, so thank you to Lisa and Pat for getting me involved in this. I guess let me start by picking up where Josh left off, which was this whole idea of, well, how do you approach this question? And anecdotes are plenty. Everybody has them, but their kid or for their neighbor's kid or for the nephew or niece. Well, that doesn't answer the policy question here, which is how can you figure out clearly whether retention has an impact? And what you see up there is a figure that sort of helps tell the tale, and I'll explain it just a little bit for you, even though it might be pretty obvious what's on there. So what you're seeing is on the little horizontal axis, the x-axis, as we statisticians like to label it, the distance from the cut score, right? And this is for one particular cohort for 1 year. And so you see how if the kid fell below that vertical line, which is the cut score for promotion, you'll see them as salmon-colored data points. Every kid who has a score that matches that. The teal-colored points, these are kids who similarly might have scored below the cut or above, but these were not retained. They were promoted for one reason or the other, per policy. The vertical axis, the y-axis, actually shows how these students scored in the 5th grade. I think you have that grade correct? Yeah. Good. So, and you notice, if you look to the left of that vertical cut point, there are enough teal-colored students, these are students who are not retained, who are scoring similarly to students who were actually retained. And so it would be tempting to think, well, why don't we look at all the kids who fell below and compare their average score, let's say average scale score, or what have you, in the 5th grade, in the 6th grade, in the 7th grade, reading, mathematics, whatever subject you have data for. Unfortunately, that's not a fair comparison, because Josh referenced this as well. The ideal thing would be to say, well, let's say I am Gandalf of the grade, right? And I have the ability to keep resetting the clock. And I take Ani and I retain him 1 year, see how he does in the 4th grade reading, then reset the clock. This time I don't retain him, and then see how he does. That would be the best comparison possible, but that cannot be done. We cannot conduct an experiment. So what you end up with is finding the best means of doing that. And the approach that we settled on from a statistical standpoint is exactly what the U.S. Department of Education recommends. This is exactly the process that gets used for a lot of policy analysis, including third-grade retention in other states that have similar policies. That is precisely the approach we've employed. Several hours in the 3 digits have gone into actually looking at the data, both descriptively, but then also working closely with the department and saying, are we getting this right? Does it look like we have this flag correct? Should we be eliminating these kids or what have you? And at the end of the day, what the methodology says you ought to do is focus very close to that cut point and find students who seem very similar based on the data that you have. Well, what data? How they scored on the third grade reading test. And any other flag you can extract from EVAs, which again I'm sure you're familiar with, right? In terms of what EVAs contain. So things like, well, is the child flag that's being limited in English proficient? Yes or no? Well, economic disadvantage? Yes or no? So putting all of that together, that little oval flags, students who seem very similar, right? And are scoring within a very narrow range of the cutoff. And of course, this shifts if you look at the report, which I hope all of you have a chance to do. You'll notice that this band that we're looking at around the cutoff tends to differ from grade to test, because there's a very extensive process that goes in saying, am I looking at students who are within 10 scale score points of the cutoff, 15? Well, what's the optimal range to focus on to make sure I have an apples to apples comparison? That's exactly what we've done here, to the best of our abilities. When we do that, the answer is not at all ambiguous. What you find is that looking at the 4th grade performance, 5th grade, 6th grade, and 7th grade, and we have to make decisions about things like PARC coming into play. So the tests are no longer the same. Well, how do you adjust for it? Well, you could, but it'd be stretching things a little bit. So we decided to shy away from it, which is why we have only focused on the limited set of cohorts that give us the cleanest data. Same thing happens once COVID hits. You've heard enough about the learning loss, no point berating that issue again. We shy away from any tests that were conducted thereafter, even after the moratorium, only because we know that data is going to be noisy and there's no sense pooling it together. So to the best of our ability, what we've determined is that if you focus on these kids using this recommended methodology, the answer is unambiguous. Students who were retained within the same band, so these are very similar to those who were not retained, end up on average doing better than those who were not retained. fell within the same range around middle school. The important thing to also recognize is that, of course, these impacts decline over time. So as you start moving into the 5th grade and the 6th grade and the 7th grade, the distance shrinks. But it isn't small. It isn't 1 or 2 scale score points. It's almost half a standard deviation for some grades, right? And it drops to as low as maybe a quarter or a fifth of a standard deviation. But that is still statistically significant, right? So, and I apologize for throwing that down in there, but I have to, since Josh referred to me as the statistician. So that's my unit card. So the results, I think, speak for themselves in many ways. And there's a lot more information. I think the story, the narrative is much richer if you look at the report, because you'll get the full flavor, even of some of the descriptive analyses that we looked at. So let me stop here at this point. And Lisa, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ami. You can see why I let them explain the research. I would not have gotten that right. So also joining us today is Dr. Kenyana Burke. And Kenyana is with Excel and Ed. She's a senior fellow, but she's also the former state literacy director in charge of Mississippi's literacy efforts, which have been wildly successful. And I'm sure many of you have read about the Mississippi story around reading. Dr. Burke is joining us today to talk a little bit about the work that Mississippi did based on the science of reading, obviously very relevant to the conversations we're having in the budget right now about the science of reading. I do want to mention that Senator Brenner could not be here today. He had a change of plans, but you will see in the press release that there are some comments from him, so I just wanted to call that out. So do we have Dr. Burke? You do?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning. Go ahead, Dr. Burke, and thank you so much for being here. I will tell you that Dr. Burke is one of the most sought-after speakers in the education community right now, and so she goes from presentation to presentation, so we were really excited that she was able to join us, albeit from the TV. So, Dr. Burke, take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for just the opportunity to share information around 3rd grade reading that we know, as stated earlier, is really a predictor for so many things as it relates to a child's quality of life when he or she becomes an adult. So when I talk about 3rd grade reading policies that aim to eliminate social promotion like we're doing today, for students who are not ready to learn once they get to 4th grade, the idea of retention is always the elephant in the room. So the purpose of a promotion policy, like the one in Ohio, is for students to be ready, not retained. Retention is not the purpose of this policy. And I believe that not enough attention has been given to those supports that students should and must receive prior to the end of the 3rd grade year. So we always talk about 3rd grade reading laws, but this is not just a 3rd grade teacher's responsibility. For any teacher, kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade, who just has the pleasure of providing reading instruction to children prior to 3rd grade, it's each teacher's responsibility, and of course the responsibility of so many other adults and stakeholders that are involved. During these years, as early as kindergarten, students should be screened. We call that early identification, just making sure that we are identifying students early so that we can provide the much needed interventions for those students. And that this policy should be considered one of prevention and intervention. You want to catch kids early, you want to give them what they need, and you want to continue to progress monitor those students. We also, as I heard mentioned earlier, especially in Mississippi and other states that have really taken on this goal of ensuring that we were improving student outcomes, is that we invest in people. We invest in improving teacher knowledge, building their capacity to teach children how to read, ensuring they are ready on day 1 to begin reading instruction and to respond to the needs of students. And providing students with an additional year of intensive interventions, progress monitoring, and other supports to get them ready to read, to learn. So retention here cannot be the same as the year before. If it's the same, then you're going to see the same results. And so that's why we talk about all of these things that are done during the retention year, whether it's the student being placed intentionally with a teacher who has proven results in reading and improving student outcomes, whether they have an individual reading plan, whether interventions are documented and monitored and changed if necessary, if students need additional support. So I want to just briefly talk about, I'm so glad that the researcher explained regression discontinuity because I cannot. I do want to talk about the results of a few studies from Florida, Mississippi, and also recently Indiana that speak to the results of their studies of the promotion retention policies in those states. So first I'll talk about Florida. And there was a study in 2017 from Florida, the effects of test-based retention on student outcomes over time, regression discontinuity evidence from Florida, that showed that retention in third grade reduced retention probabilities in future years. And this other interesting point out of another study of Florida's third grade retention of 2018, called the cost and benefits of test-based promotion, it speaks to the threat of retention, leading to statistically significant and substantial increases in student math and reading performance within the third grade prior to the retention decision. So what does that mean? It just means that the promotion policy is doing what is intended. If there is a gate from leaving the third grade to into the fourth grade, that means that we know, if you look at backwards mapping, right, we know that there are things that must be put into place in kindergarten. So for those educators who said, okay, if these things are not in place by the time this child gets to the end of third grade, he or she will be promoted. It really is about changing the adult behavior as well. And with changing the adult behavior, making sure that there's not just accountability in third grade, because that's what we're used to. We're used to the state assessment showing us how our third and eighth graders are doing or how our high school students are doing. And we also have to have accountability for kindergarten, first, and second grade, and ensuring that those students are growing to meet those expectations. And so when we talk about Indiana, this study was completed last year, 2022, and these researchers showed that in Indiana, third grade retention increased the achievement in English language arts and math immediately and substantially, and the effects persisted through middle school. But we also looked at some non-academic outcomes, right? So a lot of studies before have talked about just how harmful retention may be to students. In this study, and what I'll talk about shortly in Mississippi, there was no evidence that being retained had an impact or effect on student attendance or on discipline, again, into middle school. So, lastly, I'll talk about Mississippi's study that was completed this year, 2023. The same model as was discussed earlier, the regression discontinuity, that's the model that we followed, and we looked at our cohort of students who were in our first cohort of students to be retained, which was in 2014, 2015, and followed those students who were retained, of course, through sixth grade, and those who were promoted just above the passing cut score into seventh grade. But we looked at the sixth grade performance of those two groups of students. And what we found was that students who passed to the next grade, but who passed because they were just above the cut score, on their sixth grade ELA assessment, they scored around the 20th percentile. But for those students who had an additional year, and were just below the cut score but had an additional third grade year, they performed in the 62nd percentile, a very statistically significant number on the sixth grade ELA assessment. As it relates to non-academic outcomes, there were also no significant impact on absences in sixth grade or 4 years after retention, and no significant impact on special education identification in sixth grade or 4 years after retention. And I do want to say that this statistically significant effect was actually largely driven by positive effects for Black and Hispanic Latino students here in Mississippi. So I'll close by saying that it is just extremely important to remember that improving literacy outcomes is a long-term commitment that requires states to stay the course. And I will be available for questions after.
Thank you, Dr. Burke, and thank you all for attending today. We know this is a super busy time with the budget and everything else that is going on. So we're happy to take a few questions, and then our speakers will be available afterwards to address any further questions you might have.
I find it interesting that the study looked at performance in the future, looking at English language as well as math. Could you talk about the correlation between reading and later performance in math?
I think there is a correlation. I can't give you a number off the top of my head. But as part of this exercise, we didn't really look at the correlation. So we did look at kids, for example, we're doing well after being retained or not retained within that little bubble on ELA, right, versus math. But we didn't, so I can't answer that. But certainly I think that's an interesting question.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, was there any, in any of the studies, either the one we did here or the one from Mississippi, is there any accounting for interventions that happen either in the retention year or in the 4th grade year? So one of the things that Dr. Burke talked about was you can't just have the same 3rd grade year, and my assumption is these retained kids get a lot of intervention. Are kids that are below the cut line but being promoted receiving that same kind of intensive intervention, or are they just being promoted, and could that account for some of the difference?
Dr. Burke, can you hear that question, or do you need me to repeat it?
We can't hear her.
She's
Oh, okay.
Hear any questions? Yes.
Okay, so what you're being asked, and Josh and Nadia will address it as well, is whether or not there were any specific interventions that you can point to that account for the improvements.
Right, yes. So with our universal screening is administered 3 times per year for students, beginning, middle, and end of year. And those students who are identified as at risk from a universal screener then receive further diagnostic assessments to identify exactly in which area the student is struggling as far as reading is concerned. Some interventions will include a small group instruction. It can also include the one-on-one tutoring, but really getting down to the lowest deficit skill for students, and those interventions are grounded in the science of reading. So it will be specific to whether it's one student or whether it's a small group of students that would need those interventions, such as, again, small group instruction, making sure that they are receiving the instruction on logical awareness and phonics and whatever their identified area of deficiency is.
And I'll just add that I think as far as our work is concerned, we didn't have the ability to actually control for interventions that were happening in the schools. To look at what kids were getting or not, or measure the quality of that intervention. So that remains a black box.
However, we're very interested in figuring that out. I think one of the things that we want to be able to add to the research is not just the fact that kids are doing better, but what is actually happening in the classroom that allows them to do better. So we've been having conversations about what that might look like. Are there case studies? There's work that the Ohio Department of Education is already doing in this space. There's some great case studies on their website. But we want to build out that base of knowledge, not just for ourselves and our policymakers, but more importantly for educators. What is working for kids and what's working for specific kids with specific deficits? Because not all kids struggle with the same thing with reading. So we need to be really intentional about the interventions and supports we're providing, not just sort of let's just throw something against the wall. And so more to come on that, and we'll invite you to the press conference when we release that research.
Does this research suggest that perhaps a lot of folks who were just above that cut score who did pass on, they should have been retained, that would have been beneficial to them?
There's a reason they're looking at me. That's an interesting question, right? And I think that gets into the what-if scenario. And I don't think the study is designed, or the method is really designed to answer that, unfortunately. But certainly, it's a very provocative and interesting question.
To clarify this, the cohort you chose, the testing switch doesn't affect that, right? You chose a specific year so that you have a comparable assessment.
Now, I will quickly add that even in terms of looking at the actual students whose data is fed into the analysis, right, there was a lot of back and forth. And now it seems like well worth it, but at that time, there are a few things that were political.
The other thing that I want to mention, because it came up in something Dr. Burke talked about with the other studies, which was the impact on absenteeism and those sorts of things. We couldn't look at that in Ohio. We wanted to look at whether or not there were some other unintended consequences, but the state does not capture that data. And so we were not able to do that. So that may be something that we look at in the future, but I didn't want people to leave thinking that was something that we had not considered. We did, it was just not possible to do with the data that's available. Any other, yeah. go ahead.
Do you plan to continue this study post-COVID, just to get an idea of whether or not there's been a generation that's been lost as a result of completely lifting the third grade guarantee temporarily?
So what I would say is yes, but I need to get my board to approve it. So you're seeing me ask Pat here publicly, which is probably, as a former boss would say, a career-limiting gesture. I think our board is very supportive of knowing what the data is. And if this is not data that we can get from the Department of Education, if they're not doing this analysis, then I think Ohio Excels absolutely will. We believe that all of the policy discussions that we have around education need to be driven by the data and what the research says. And so I think one of the roles that Ohio Excels plays, along with some other advocates in the state, is really to take a look at the research and the data and share with our policymakers and other stakeholders about, what are the impacts of some of the policies that we're putting in place.
So, the Ohio Education Research Center, which I'm the director of, and is at Ohio State University, we do a series of projects with state government agencies every year, and so we already are doing a follow-up in terms of the attendance outcomes, which is a data point we have very high quality data on. The disciplinary outcomes are harder because the measurement is more difficult to tease out. And the RIMS, which are the intervention strategies, is a possible follow-on if there's interest from the board.
Any other questions? Otherwise, we will thank you for coming, and as we said, our speakers are available. We really appreciate you being here today. I think you heard from all of our speakers how important we believe this policy is, and more importantly, the urgency and the critical nature of helping our kids read. We cannot drop the ball on this, and so we will continue to push our policymakers and others to do what we believe is right for kids. So thank you all for being here today, and have a great weekend, and we'll stick around if you have questions.